Last summer, my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned tunnels beneath Ridgeway Asylum. The place had been shut down for decades, officially due to safety hazards, but rumors swirled about what really went on down there. People said the tunnels were used to transport the most dangerous patients in secret, out of sight, out of mind. Some believed that not all of them made it back up. There were 4 of us: me, Jake, Evan, and Mia. We'd done urban exploration before, but nothing like this. Evan had found a way into the tunnels through an old drainage pipe behind the asylum's ruins. It was a tight squeeze, and the air inside was thick with dust and mildew. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. The first part of the tunnel was exactly what we expected. Damp walls covered in graffiti, rusted pipes running along the ceiling, old stretchers and wheelchairs left to rot. Felt eerie but manageable. Then we hit the first cave-in. The main passage was completely blocked by fallen concrete and twisted rebar. We had to take a side path which was much narrower. The deeper we went, the colder it got. The air smelled stale, like something had been sealed down here for years. About an hour in, Mia found something strange. A backpack. It wasn't old and decayed like everything else. It looked almost new. There were protein bars inside, a half-empty water bottle, even a flashlight with fresh batteries. Someone had been down here recently. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, not ours. We all froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps echoing down the tunnel. We shut off our lights and pressed ourselves against the walls. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps got closer. A tall, thin man came into view, dragging something behind him. A large plastic sheet, crinkling softly as it scraped against the ground. He stopped just a few feet away from us. My stomach dropped as he turned his head slightly, as if listening. Then, without a word, he stepped into a small room just off the main tunnel. A moment later, we heard it. A whisper, faint but clear. "I told you not to leave." Mia clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. None of us moved. Then came the sound of shuffling, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. That was enough for us. We slowly started inching backward, careful not to make any noise. Then, from inside the room, a metallic clatter. The footsteps started again. Fast this time. We ran. We didn't care about being quiet anymore. The tunnels were a maze, and in our panic, we kept taking wrong turns. The sound of heavy footsteps behind us kept getting closer. My flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I swore I heard breathing just behind me. Finally, Evan shouted he had found the ladder. The old metal rungs were slick with condensation, but we scrambled up as fast as we could. I was the last one, and just as I reached the top, I felt something grab my ankle. I kicked hard, and whoever or whatever was down there let go. We slammed the metal hatch shut and locked it. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then, from below, a slow, deliberate knock. 1, 2, 3. We never went back. I moved into my new apartment about 3 months ago. It's a small place in a quiet town, the kind of town where everyone seems to know each other, but they don't necessarily welcome newcomers with open arms. I didn't mind. I wasn't looking to make friends. I just needed a change of scenery, somewhere peaceful where I could focus on myself for a while. Not far from my apartment, there's an old playground. It's nothing special, just a few swings, a slide, and one of those merry-go-rounds that look like they haven't spun in years. The paint is peeling, the swings are rusted, and the entire place feels forgotten. But what struck me as odd was that I never saw anyone there. No kids, no teenagers hanging around at night, no parents taking their children to play. It was just there. The first time I noticed something strange was about a week after I moved in. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard this faint creaking sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but something about it unsettled me. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I got up, walked to my window, and looked outside. The swings were moving, not just swaying a little from the breeze, moving, as if someone was sitting in them, pumping their legs back and forth. But there was no one there. The air was still, not even a hint of wind. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe a delayed reaction from the wind earlier in the night. I went back to bed and forced myself to ignore it. The next day, I mentioned it casually to my neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Haywood. She had lived in the building for over 30 years, and I figured if anyone knew about that playground, it would be her. The moment I brought it up, her expression changed. She went stiff, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "No one goes there at night," she said, her voice flat. I laughed nervously. "Why not?" She hesitated, then just shook her head. "Just don't. It's not safe." That was all she said. No explanation, no elaboration. Just that it wasn't safe. Of course, that only made me more curious. That night, I stayed up, waiting to see if I'd hear the sound again. Sure enough, around 2:30 a.m., the creaking started. I went to the window. The swings were moving again. This time, I decided to record it. I pulled out my phone and started filming, but when I checked the footage, all I saw were the swings. Completely still. I felt my stomach tighten. I had just watched them move with my own eyes. Why wasn't it showing up on the video? At this point, my curiosity turned into an obsession. I started digging into the town's history, looking for any information about the playground. What I found made my skin crawl. In the early 1990s, several children went missing in this town. They were last seen playing near that very playground. Their bodies were never found. The only things left behind were their belongings, bicycles, backpacks, shoes. No one knew what happened to them. The cases went cold. It was eerie, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. The missing kids had nothing to do with what I was seeing. I was letting my imagination run wild. Then, one night, I decided to set up a real camera. Something better than my phone. I positioned it facing the playground and let it run overnight. The next morning, I checked the footage. First, everything was normal. The playground was empty, silent. But then, at exactly 2:43 a.m., the camera caught something. A figure. It was small, crouched, right next to the slide. It was blurry, like it wasn't fully there, but I could see enough. It was facing the camera, watching. My chest tightened. I rewound the footage, pausing it at the exact moment the figure appeared. I could make out the shape of a head, limbs tucked close to the body. It was just sitting there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went to the playground. In the daylight, it felt less threatening, just an abandoned play area left to rot. But as I walked toward the slide, something caught my eye. Half buried in the sand was a small shoe. I pulled it out, brushing off the dirt. Inside, written in faded marker, were initials. My heart pounded as I searched the names of the missing children. It matched. I dropped the shoe and turned to leave, my entire body buzzing with adrenaline. Then I heard it. Laughter. Faint, high-pitched, like a child's giggle. I whipped around. There was no one there. But when I looked down, the sand around the slide was different. Disturbed. Fresh footprints, leading toward the slide. Ones that hadn't been there before. I work maintenance for a company that contracts out to inspect old buildings before demolition. Most of the time, it's boring, checking for structural weaknesses, making sure there's no asbestos, and ensuring no squatters are living inside. But this job, this one stuck with me. I was sent to an old textile factory on the outskirts of town, scheduled for demolition in a few weeks. It had been abandoned for about 20 years. From what I was told, there was a serious accident back in the early 2000s, some kind of machinery failure that killed multiple workers. Lawsuits were filed, the company went bankrupt, and no one ever bought the property. It just sat there, slowly rotting. The building itself was massive, 4 floors plus a basement. The exterior was covered in graffiti, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. As I walked up, I noticed the front doors had a heavy chain looped through the handles, but the lock had rusted so badly it barely held together. It snapped apart with one good tug. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of old oil and mildew clung to everything. Sunlight streamed through the shattered windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The machines, once the heart of the factory, stood like rusted skeletons, frozen in time. I moved through each section, noting areas of structural weakness, collapsed ceilings, and water damage. Pretty standard. Then I reached the basement. The staircase groaned under my weight as I descended. The air down there was different, colder, stagnant. My flashlight flickered against the cracked concrete walls, revealing strange markings. Rows upon rows of tally marks, carved deep. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them, stretching across the walls like a prisoner's calendar. I told myself it was just graffiti. Maybe some squatter had camped down here for a while. But then I found the bedroll in the corner, surrounded by empty food cans. Except, the cans weren't old. I picked one up, turning it over in my hands. The expiration date was still years away. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffling sound, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I snapped it off immediately, holding my breath. My heart pounded in my ears as I listened. Something was moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was down here with me. A figure emerged from the darkness, barely visible in the faint slivers of light seeping through cracks in the ceiling. He was thin, alarmingly thin. His skin stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were filthy, hanging off his skeletal frame in tattered rags. He clutched a rusted wrench in one hand, his fingers wrapped around it like a lifeline. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The man dragged the wrench along the wall as he walked, his gaze fixed on something unseen. He muttered under his breath, words too quiet for me to understand. Then he stopped, turned his head ever so slightly, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come down here." My body finally remembered how to move. I turned and bolted for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. My radio was clipped to my belt, but my hands were shaking too much to grab it. I reached the top and slammed into the door, shoving it with everything I had. It didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my crowbar. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed up the stairs behind me. Then voices, my team calling my name. The door burst open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. My coworker grabbed my arm, asking what the hell happened. I turned back, pointing toward the basement. But it was empty. No sign of the man. No bedroll. No food cans. Just the tally marks, scratched out violently, as if someone had tried to erase them with shaking hands. I quit that job a month later. They tore the factory down as planned, and nothing was ever found in the basement. But I still dream about it sometimes. The whisper in the dark, the tally marks, and the man who never left. I never should have gone out there alone. That's what I keep telling myself now. But at the time, it felt like just another project. I was working on a documentary about unsolved disappearances when I stumbled across the story of Camp Briarwood. It was a summer camp that had shut down in the 80s after 3 counselors vanished without a trace. Their belongings were found, their cars still parked in the lot, but no bodies. No sign of struggle. Nothing. The case was cold, but the mystery haunted me. I figured a trip out there would add some eerie footage to my film. So I packed my gear and made the hike. The camp was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows through the trees. The place was in ruins. The cabins were rotting, their roofs caved in, furniture overturned and left to decay. The trails were barely visible beneath layers of dead leaves and undergrowth. But the main lodge was still standing. I pushed the heavy door open, coughing as dust filled the air. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect from a place abandoned for decades. Broken chairs, shattered windows, graffiti scrawled on the walls. But then, in one of the back rooms, I found something unexpected. A cardboard box filled with old Polaroids. I started flipping through them, fascinated. Most were of kids playing, counselors laughing, the kind of wholesome summer camp memories you'd expect. But then I found one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me. Not me as a kid. Not some coincidence where a counselor just happened to look like me. No, it was me wearing the same jacket, the same backpack, standing just outside the main lodge. And it was taken from the bushes. I spun around, scanning the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Someone had been watching me. Someone was out there. I grabbed my camera and bolted outside, yelling into the trees. "Who's there?" Silence. Just the wind rustling through the leaves. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Had someone been following me? How long had they been here? And why take that picture? I knew I should leave, but the filmmaker in me couldn't walk away just yet. I needed to document this, so I forced myself to stay the night. I set up cameras around my tent, hoping to catch any movement. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to whispering. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling trees. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction. Then my cameras picked up movement. Shadowy figures, just beyond the light, darting between the trees. They never stepped fully into view, just hovering at the edges. Watching, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. But the second I stepped out, the whispering stopped. The forest was empty. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up and ran back to my car, my heart pounding with every step. I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors before taking a breath. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I pulled out my camera and started reviewing the footage. The shadowy figures were unsettling enough, but it was the last frame that made my stomach drop. Just before the recording cut out, there was a face. Blurred, out of focus, but right next to my tent. And when I got home, I went back through the camp's history. I found an old group photo of the missing counselors. One of them looked exactly like me. I haven't been able to sleep since. I work as a traveling salesman, which means long hours on the road, cheap motels, and a lot of fast food. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. I was driving through some nowhere stretch of highway when the storm rolled in. Sheets of rain hammered my windshield, and my wipers were barely doing anything. I was already running late for a meeting the next morning when my car sputtered and died. No signal, no towns nearby, just endless stretches of dark road. That's when I saw it. A faded neon vacancy sign flickering in the distance. It was an old roadside motel, the kind you see in horror movies, but at that moment I didn't care. I just needed a place to stay until morning. I pulled into the lot. There were no other cars, just a few overgrown weeds creeping through the cracks in the asphalt. The office door was unlocked, and inside, everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. The desk had an old-fashioned guest ledger, and when I flipped through it, I noticed someone had signed in just a few days ago. Room 6, I muttered to myself, seeing the last entry. There was no one at the front desk. No bell to ring. I called out, but only the sound of the rain answered me. I grabbed a key from the wall, picking one at random, room 3. It wasn't locked, and inside, everything was fine. The bed was made, there were fresh towels, and the room smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, like someone had just been there. A single lamp flickered weakly beside the bed. Too tired to question it, I locked the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the mattress. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was a sharp knock at the door. I jolted awake. My heart pounded. I waited. Nothing. Then it came again, 3 slow knocks. I slid out of bed and crept to the peephole. The hallway was empty. Just the dim, flickering light from the office seeping under my door. I stood there for a long moment, listening, but everything was silent again. I shook it off. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the storm had rattled something loose. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up. And then the tap at the window. Soft, deliberate. A slow scrape against the glass. I turned my head just enough to see the silhouette of a car parked outside. But that car wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't about to pull the curtain back. Instead, I listened. The wind howled, the rain pelted the window, but nothing else came. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually exhaustion won. At dawn, the storm had passed, and everything looked normal. Too normal. I grabbed my stuff and stepped outside, glancing toward the car that had appeared in the middle of the night. It was an old sedan, rusted and covered in dirt, like it had been sitting there for years. But that wasn't the worst part. The driver's side door was open, and there was no one inside. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, so I turned toward my own car and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting on my driver's seat was a motel key. Not just any key. Room 3, the room I had just stayed in. I hadn't brought the key with me. I was sure of it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I slowly looked back at the motel office. There, in the window, stood a figure. Not moving, not waving, just watching. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped them. My car, which had refused to start the night before, roared to life on the first turn. I didn't hesitate. I slammed it into reverse, tires screeching as I tore out of the lot. As I sped away, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The motel was gone. No sign, no building, just an empty lot overgrown with weeds, like it had been abandoned for years.